Lee Esther Logan is 55 years old and disabled, and she has spent her entire life in Cairo, Illinois, in a public housing high-rise that looks out over the Ohio River. Most days there are coal barges out there, moving downriver toward the point where the Mississippi and the Ohio meet, and where the borders of Illinois, Kentucky, and Missouri come close enough to touch. She has watched that view long enough that it stopped being scenery and became something closer to a clock. Cairo was chartered in 1818, though no one actually settled there until a second attempt nearly 2 decades later, when a company out of Boston hired workmen to build levees, a shipyard, and a hotel on land everyone understood to be flood-prone from the start. During the Civil War, the town served as a Union staging ground and a stop on the Underground Railroad, and formerly enslaved people fleeing the South found refuge there in large numbers. The black population grew from just 47 residents in 1860 to 1849 a decade later, and many of those families stayed after the war ended, building the churches, schools, and businesses that became the foundation of Cairo's black community. The flooding never really stopped being a threat. In 1937, the Ohio River crested at 59.5 feet, and while towns up and down the river were devastated, Cairo's levees held. The Army Corps of Engineers had blown a breach in the nearby Birds Point levee just to relieve pressure on Cairo's flood wall, sacrificing farmland to save the town. It happened again in 2011, when the Mississippi rose high enough to threaten 15 feet of water through the city, forcing a full evacuation, and once again the Corps breached levees in Missouri rather than let the water reach Cairo. Both times, the town survived the water. Neither time did surviving the water bring back what the town had already lost. Railroad bridges built in the 1880s and the completion of a second bridge at Thebes in 1905 had already stripped away the ferry trade that once justified the town's existence, and by the time cars replaced trains, 2 new highway bridges routed drivers around Cairo entirely rather than through it. Racial violence shadowed the same decades. A black man named William James was lynched in Cairo in 1909, and in 1967, another lynching of a young man named Robert Hunt set off riots and led a group of white residents to organize themselves as the White Hats. 2 years later, in 1969, Reverend Charles Cohen, who had grown up in the Pyramid Court public housing complex and organized nationally with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, came home and founded a group called the United Front, which sued the housing authority over conditions in Pyramid Court and organized an economic boycott of white-owned businesses downtown. In 1972, residents of that same complex testified to a federal civil rights commission that their apartments were overcrowded and infested with roaches and rats, and that when repairs were made at all, tenants were billed for the cost. Cairo held about 15,000 people at its peak in the 1920s. Local reporting put it at around 2,600 as recently as 2019. By 2024, city records put the population at 1,506. Alexander County, of which Cairo is the seat, lost more than 36% of its population between 2010 and 2020, the steepest drop of any county in the country over that decade. The federal paper trail behind that decline goes back further than most people realize. Between May of 2010 and November of 2014, HUD sent the Alexander County Housing Authority a series of letters outlining serious physical, managerial, and financial failures, according to a letter Illinois Congressman Mike Bost later sent to HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge. It wasn't until August of 2015 that HUD entered into a voluntary compliance agreement with the authority. When that didn't fix things either, HUD placed the authority into receivership in February of 2016, taking direct control. 3 months after that, 30 residents sued the authority over mold, roaches, and plumbing that didn't work, most of them tenants at the McBride and Elmwood complexes. The lawsuits settled that summer, with plaintiffs receiving around $10,000 each, along with vouchers and relocation money. By 2017, the Department of Housing and Urban Development had announced it would demolish McBride and Elmwood outright, calling the buildings beyond repair. The agency budgeted $6 million for the work, though the contract eventually awarded, 2 years later, came in under $2 million, in part because prevailing wage laws do not apply to demolition the way they apply to new construction. That contract raised 280 apartments. Of the roughly 130 families who had relocated by the time it was signed, about 2/3 ended up somewhere else entirely, most often in Carbondale, Illinois, or Cape Girardeau, Missouri, each about an hour away, because Cairo itself no longer had enough private rental housing left to absorb them. The same pattern played out on a smaller scale in Thebes, a village in the same county, where 2 more complexes closed around the same period. When residents there pushed back on the timeline, Illinois Senators Dick Durbin and Tammy Duckworth called the deadline the department had set completely unacceptable. No demolition date was ever given for the Thebes buildings. None was needed. The people were already gone. Which brings the story to the Connell F. Smith Sr. building, the 58-unit high-rise on Cairo's riverbank where Logan lives, built in either 1967 or 1968, depending on which record you check, with balconies that face the water. In October of 2022, HUD told the roughly 60 residents living there that an engineering assessment had found the building unsafe in the event of an earthquake, because it sits near the new Madrid Seismic Zone and was built on wood piles rather than the steel piles used in more modern construction. 53 families were told they had until early the following year to leave. A letter from the Cairo Historical Preservation Project noted that for some of those families, this would be the second time in 5 years they'd been forced to relocate from public housing in the same town. Harry McDowell Jr., 83 years old, a retired car salesman who had buried his wife that same July, said he didn't know how he was going to shop for an apartment during the holidays, at his age, with everything still so raw. Tony McNeil, who had lived 15 years in the neighboring Schuster building before moving to Smith 5 years earlier, decided he wasn't waiting around to find out if the engineers were right, and made plans to move to Charleston, Missouri. Kaneesha Mallory, who had a 2-year-old daughter at the time, did something different. She stayed in Cairo, relocating one building over to the Schumacher complex next door. Cairo is home, she said, and if she ever had to leave the town itself, she didn't know what else she'd do. What happened next is the part that didn't go according to the announcement. The original deadline to vacate, March 3rd of 2023, came and went, and nobody was evicted. Stephen Tarver, of the Alexander County Housing Advisory Board, said a resolution passed that January meant remaining residents weren't being charged rent while things got sorted out, and that management was working with people day by day rather than forcing anyone out on a schedule. As of that March, roughly 80% of the original tenants were still living there. By May, the number had thinned. 33 of the 53 families had left. 20 remained. HUD, for its part, had said all along that it hadn't been able to find a private developer willing to build anything new in a town with Cairo's economics, and that once a building emptied out, the plan was simply to seal it off. The building never actually came down, or at least it hadn't as of the most recent public housing records available. A federal housing directory listing dated March of 2025 still showed the Connell F. Smith building standing, with 2 public housing units listed as available for rent at prices between $205 and $462 a month, depending on income. 2.5 years after HUD said the building was too dangerous to keep occupied, it was still occupied, just by fewer people than before. The rest of the town kept thinning out in its own quiet way during those same years. In 2023, Cairo got its first grocery store since 2015. It closed again in 2025 after sales came in lower than expected. Cairo's Head Start preschool program shut down the year before that. What's left is a town where the buildings that are still standing mostly aren't being used for much of anything, waiting out whatever comes next. Logan told a reporter, not long after she learned her building was on the list, that she didn't want to leave Cairo. As far as the most recent records show, she hasn't had to.